This is my short version of my reading reflection. Okay, obviously, I want to talk about how, in the intro, the whole Michael Dunn situation, how he shot into a car of black teenagers all over something as little as their music being too loud. Obviously, this had to do with uh, race and racial tensions. I feel like personally, it wouldn't have happened, or he wouldn't have done this if it had to do with white teenagers. It then talked about police brutality and how um, it's a huge topic right now, especially with all the riots that are going on with police brutality and all the trials that are going on with similar stories like the ones mentioned in the articles. Also, the one thing that I wanted to point out was the police brutality towards black disabled people. That was something never personally I've witnessed on the media, so I found it interesting that it's not mentioned on media a lot when it should be, because that's just as big as a normal black person being brutalized by the police. Um, and I was shocked at how many stories they just included in that one reading about um, black disabled people being injured or killed just because of simple things. For example, this one guy didn't take his hands out of his pocket, so he got tasered. Insane. That's insane to me. But to move on, I wanted to talk about also the school to prison pipeline. They talked about that a lot. I obviously had a lot of questions in class about it, and how it's hard for me to grasp how the school to prison pipeline is such a huge thing. It is such a huge thing everywhere. I personally never experienced it in my own school. Um, so yeah, I found it very interesting that they talked about that again, and how discipline sets them up for the school to prison pipeline. Um, Also, I wanted to talk about they discussed how disability is perceived as a burden, and how it showed hatefully in the media, politics, and even music. Um, this made me super mad because they talked about how judges felt bad for parents who had killed their own kids just because of their disability, which I find insane personally, because I have a nephew who has autism, so I can't imagine him being killed by his parents just because of, the disability that he has. Also, I wanted to talk about how people or how violence is justified by black victims, um, by their lifestyles and histories, and how it's not considered normal. In my opinion, there's nothing that is considered normal. Everybody's different. Everybody has their own, unique way of living. Um, Also, I disagreed with how Discrit rejects adding disability to intersectionality. We talked about that as well in class. Um, I feel that intersectionality is showing how, as a person, you are more than one thing. You're more than just a race. You're more than just a gender. You're more than just a social class. You're all these intersecting things that make you who you are, as well as that video we watched where we aren't just one story, we have multiple stories of what makes us who we are. So adding disability to that obviously would make sense, because there are people who that's a big part of their life, that contributes to who they are. Um, Also, it talked about um, dislocation. We talked about how dislocation is the rational excuse for people to see people, see families, schools, communities, and the children themselves as being disrespectable, and how they kick them out, and don't want to waste their time, how teachers don't want to waste their time on them, um, just because of who they are, or what their racial or social background is. So they talked about that a lot. They also talked about pins. That concept to me was very interesting, because kids could be considered delinquent just because of truancy, which in my opinion, like kids, like if you actually got to know the kids, like the reason why they were missing school, they could be like Ray, who was in a class, or a dance class that he didn't want to be in. Like the reason he skipped was because of that. There's certain factors of like why kids are not showing up to school. It could be also that these kids, they feel like they're not like cared about, so they don't want to show up to class. Also, I find it messed up with this like whole delinquency thing, like making kids delinquent just because of truancy or like stereotyping them. That is a way to remove the child from schools and maybe their families in general. The article also talked about zero tolerance and how it is considered like high surveillance on race and disabled people. Personally, to me, this sounds like a prison, so of course it feels like they're being led to juvie or prison, because if they're being treated like they're in the jail, obviously they're going to feel, like they're heading there, or, yeah. Also talked about how students who are of color, have low income, receive different labels than white students do. Like students of color and are labeled as emotionally disturbed, whereas like white children are described as having a specific disability. And like with this being said, they're like giving different services and treatments, which I think is ridiculous, because you could have two different kids of two different races and them still have the same disability, but them being characterized differently just because of color. I feel like by that point, like the doctor should be doing their job and like diagnosing the right thing and providing the right treatment or providing the right services to help these kids. Also, one of the big things that I reacted on, and I reacted on this in class as well, is the Wayne dollars concept. This made me so mad. I can't believe this is even an idea. Whoever came up with it was a total idiot. I found it insane how they were excluding kids. Like, they were trying to make this reward system by excluding kids, but these kids like wanted to participate, which I think is the biggest crucial thing. Like, if you're trying to do a reward system, don't exclude kids. Like, these kids want to be a part of the pep rallies. They want to be a part of school events. And like people even like, or like teachers and like administration even describe these kids like in criminalizing languages such as being counterfeiters or gamblers, just because they were finding ways to get more dollars so they could participate, which is just an insane concept to me. Also, they talked about the naughties approach. This physical ed teacher I found was not doing what a teacher's supposed to do. She wasn't reaching out at all. Like, she felt like just because there was a few naughties in the class that she didn't actually need to go out of her way and like help them get back on the right track, because she could push them off to the next person like as soon as they go to the next grade level. So that was a huge point that I wanted to make, that you can't just keep pushing off kids. Like, you have to sometimes sit down and like talk to them and help them get on the right track, because you alone can make a huge impact in their lives. So yeah, that teacher just describing as naughties of all things was crazy to me. And the last point I wanted to make quickly was the whole Sally situation. She was a second grade teacher who had been teaching at the same school for 26 years, and she had a hard time relating structural problems in the school to discipline issues. Obviously, if there's a lot of kids getting disciplined and get a lot of kids like being suspended, like, it's not just the kids. It's like the school needs to step back and realize that like maybe they're disciplining too hard, or they're not disciplining in the right way. They're more punishing than disciplining and stuff like that. And I also described her in my notes as a drama queen. She talked about how these kids were walking over dead bodies, walking to school, and how terrible the community was, and how terrible families and students were, and how they were disrespectful. And while describing this, she made sure to include that she was like not racist at all, which I feel like a lot of people do, like we discussed in class. Like, a lot of people do that. But like I feel like if she would have simply just took the time to learn about her community and her kids and her families, like she wouldn't have this such an extreme, like drama filled version of the school that she's working in. So yeah, that was a super quick version of my thing. So yeah,